This is a handy summary of values throughout the game space. Values are important because a lot of our discussions about games deal with values. Violence in video games, tropes versus women in video games, Gamergate. These are all discussions about values because they're about what people find important. Violence is bad, so why is it in the games we play? Why are game characters over-sexualized? Why is this game so politically correct? Values at play is a useful design framework for looking at this. But what about values more broadly? How do they interface with development or publication, for example? We'll look at this using the GameSpace model, which has 5 discrete stages that cover the whole game lifecycle, from concept all the way through to afterplay. First, we have to figure out what values are. This is kind of tricky considering they're inherently linked to what people find important. Looking at definitions, we can get some ideas. Values are abstract, they deal with relationships, motivations, attitudes, and traditions. They can be properties of things or states of affairs, qualities of environments, personal traits, political states, or even grand ideals. Values tend to eschew specific descriptions for more abstract ones. We can summarize this into our own definition. Values are the abstract representation of properties, actions, and motivations used to describe concepts that an individual or group finds significant. Now we can look at the game space to see how values integrate into each space. There are 8 game-as components in 5 spaces. The design space deals with concept and ideation, the development space deals with making the game, the publication space deals with publication, and the interaction space is where the game is actually played. Finally, the reportage space looks at how the game is analyzed and critiqued based on how players recall their experience. There are various ways we can integrate values into the design space, but they're broadly separated into narrative, systems, and presentation. Values exist in narrative because of how a context is presented. A game about throwing oddly shaped Jews down a well sounds gross, but it's also Tetris. A simple coat of narrative paint can heavily engage players with values. Systemic integration of values is slightly harder, but it can be done. For example, Train gained notoriety for being a mechanics-driven game where players unknowingly transport people into concentration camps. Values can also exist in presentation. The black and white world of Chicory explores values of creativity, well-being, and expression by having players color the world in after a character falls into depression. Values can be integrated into the development space when developers consider the kinds of experiences they want to make. Making personal games can be a useful way to explore and process lived experiences. As a result, personal game jams are becoming increasingly popular. These game jams use simple tools like Bitsy to empower marginalized creators to learn about and make games. Developers need to engage with these experiences and their own values to actually make the game. Values most often appear in the publication space with publishers' organizational values. Valve has had a bit of a torrid time with this. They initially claimed that their values wouldn't influence the games they published on Steam, but controversies surrounding games like Active Shooter and Rape Day made them quickly change their guidance. Given that kind of controversy, publishers might want to avoid games that deal with values. But the critical success of The Walking Dead Season 1, The Last of Us Part 2, Death Stranding, and Life is Strange True Colors suggests that some players really enjoy playing with values, which leads nicely to the interaction space, which deals with how values manifest when a game is played. This is typically how we think about values in games, and as a result, countless values can manifest depending on the game. So let's look at why players might want to intentionally play with values. This can range from basic morality play, killing the quest giver, to dark play and positive-negative experiences, where players intentionally court negative experiences to safely and cathartically explore their own values. Looking at specific values, empathy has recently exploded in popularity. Games like Real Lives allow players to fully embody the perspective of characters from anywhere in the world, using real-world data, and task players to live their lives. Violence is most interesting when looked at through the lens of irony. September 12th tasked players with eliminating terrorists in an Arabian marketplace, except the explosion radius is so large that you inevitably kill some civilians who become terrorists themselves. Then, for well-being, there are things like the Games for Health agenda. Games like Pokemon Go and Zombies Run. The sector's growing though, with more games tackling mental health like Depression Quest, just as fun as it sounds, and Self-Care, a game in which you stay in bed all day and cuddle your cat. Finally, there's the reportage space, where our values influence how we think and talk about games. Generally, when we talk about values in games, we're talking about pro-social ones. Kindness, sharing, community, things that can make the player better, and indeed, games can have these effects if they're so designed. These games can help players process personal experiences. Depression Quest players, for example, reported that playing it encouraged them to seek help, suggesting that games could potentially be used as a form of creative arts therapy. Then there are the discussions of values that games should or shouldn't embed. Games might always be criticized for being too sexual, too violent, or too offensive, and some people might disagree. That's why understanding values is important. It allows us to reason that a pig raping a human might be justified in a horror game, but coercing an African-American protagonist to rape someone in a first-person shooter probably isn't. We can integrate these discussions into the game space diagram to create a taxonomy for values in games. It shows that values are everywhere, and that's really important. Values aren't just weird philosophical stuff, but rather a core part of games, and considering them in all areas of the game's lifecycle can help move the medium forward.